Good evening, everybody. Really nice to have you here with us this evening. This is part of the series on change, personal change, change as a consequence of our will and desire to make ourselves different in ways that affect the way we read the world, the way we read reality. That's in terms of mind, change in terms of the feelings that flow and course through us, make them more balanced, emotional intelligence, emotional regulation, and the like. We've looked at health issues. There was a major discussion last night. And today we're going to look at the Kabbalistic concept of change through the process of increasing our motivation level. Firstly, I think it's probably good to assert that change, and tonight we've had a change in Prime Minister, so it's a very apt kind of setting this evening, that many people don't believe that change is possible. Many people believe that we are pretty much indelibly placed in our genetic framework and in our environmental framework, and that we are prisoners of those two factors. And some of you have heard me say over and over again that that is simply not so. But if that's what you believe, it's very likely that's what will happen. Belief systems are crucial. Our axiomatic positions in life are central to whether we can actually exercise change or not. The research in more recent times clearly demonstrates that there's 40%, if we want to allocate percentages, of free will capacity to change everything about us. Yes, there is a set point that's genetically controlled, and that's another 40%, 50% some say, and then there's a circumstantial setting, our environment, another 10%. But both of those can be affected by the way that we actually exercise freedom to change. It doesn't mean just because we feel we can change or want to change that we will. We have to undo habitual patterns, default patterns. We have to undo the way that our neurotransmitters have engrooven within our mind and have to be able to create new pathways. That requires new practices and the like. That's the kind of discussion that's taken place over the past few weeks. Tonight's discussion is going to be somewhat different. I'm going to look at what it is that actually drives us if we so choose to change. We use the word motivation. Could you help me to define what motivation is, or what you understand by what is motivation? Anyone in the room?
It's incentive.
Incentive. Okay. Incentive might point to something external, and motivation is something that happens internally.
It's a strong desire, a very strong will to do something.
Okay, it's associated with will and the like.
Not happy where you are.
A dissatisfaction which drives you to create change, because there are many people who have dissatisfaction in life and live with it without necessarily doing much about it.
An energy push.
An energy push, and you're using a metaphor of energy, but how do we tap that energy? How do we create the energy? Is it an energy?
Having a goal, a set goal that you want to work towards.
It's an important factor in terms of directing motivation, but might not be motivation per se itself.
A will for change.
A will for change. Yeah, we spoke about desire. And we're going to distinguish motivation and desire and various other factors, and we're going to be able to dissect these in ways where we can actually utilize tools to drive ourselves towards change as such. It's important to initiate change because the world doesn't change unless we change. Fortunately, everything's in a constant state of change. Nothing remains the same. And you've heard me say that previously also. And it's one of the wonderful curiosities of the world that every moment of time is a moment where the world has utterly changed. Nothing remains constant. Nothing remains the same. And the reason is because everything's in a state of motion. Everything's in a state of movement. Ever since Hashem breathed the breath of life into creation per se, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, Hashem breathed into the nostrils of the human being, so to speak, the breath of life, but that breath metaphorically animates the world. The Hebrew word for change is shinui. The Hebrew word for a year is shana, Rosh Hashanah, okay? Same root. In other words, the word for a year means the process of change that has taken place in between those two parameters of beginning and end. So time is one of the basic constructs of existence. The other basic construct of existence is place. Everything keeps changing its place. Constant movement. The molecules don't remain in the same place. They keep moving. The tendrils in your brain keep growing in different formats according to your thought patterns. Nothing remains the same. And then there's a third dimension, and that third dimension is consciousness. Time, place, and consciousness are the three basic characteristics of this creation. You will find nothing outside of those three. Those three cover everything. Space, things, is rearrangement of placement of things. The way things are in a state of different appearance is a result of change. A flower grows, moves, and human consciousness is what has the ability to observe that, recognize it, and measure it. Okay, we're going to come back to these three factors because nothing exists outside of them, and they dictate what is changed. Now there's something further. When we change, the world changes with us. Consciousness fields means that the way that we are conscious, my consciousness, encompasses you. What I'm thinking at any one moment leaves a subtle residual effect on everybody in the room and in the world. Each one of us is infinite. The truth is everything is infinite. Everything influences everything. Why astrologers were able to measure and understand once upon a time the way that there's an interplay between the movements within the solar system and beyond and ourselves is because we're within the consciousness fields of these particles, and they are within our consciousness fields. Today astrology is no longer really measurable because that science has long since passed on. However, the truth is, whatever you may be thinking and feeling right now affects the person next to you and two down from you, and by extension to the rest of the world. So there's a responsibility in terms of the way we think. There's a responsibility in terms of the way we feel because we affect everything. And if we actually live that way, we actually want to grow. We want to be able to practice the self-mastery that allows us to create positive consciousness fields that envelop people and the like. We used words before: desire, wanting, energy, and others. Could someone share with me if there have been any distinctive features in your life that have propelled you towards change, motivated you? If you want to share with us, has there been significant factors, or not even significant factors? What has moved you to initiate some process of change? Now, if you go there, you'll be right in front of the camera. Right now, we have the most wonderful view of the back of your head. Okay.
I didn't know that was on.
Crisis.
A divorce.
Okay, like a divorce.
It's not about the issue, it's about the perception. And you change your perception and you want to do things differently and you wonder how you can. And that's, I think, what change is all about.
Okay.
Not being completely different, just slightly, and trying to see a situation from a different perspective.
Excellent. So why is it that some people keep repeating the same mistake over and over again? And perhaps even marrying the same kind of person by mistake over and over again. In other words, that doesn't work for everybody. Why? What is it that makes an incident or circumstance in a life distinctive enough that it propels you forward, that creates a different vantage point of reality, that creates the change? Otherwise, the default takes over, and you repeat the same thing over and over again.
Well, maybe it's because everything is not just bad and not just good.
It's neutral?
Complex. No, they're complex. They're made of good and they're bad
Okay.
elements. And some of the good elements are familiar to you and you
Yes.
get attracted to them because it's more comfortable.
Yes.
And then the bad ones are still there though, and in the end they overtake you, possibly, if there are enough there to make yourself finally extricate yourself
Okay.
from the negative circumstance.
So the kind of model that you're proposing is that there are things out there that are good and bad that sort of influence you, and change is a product of the way that we exercise relationship with them?
Well, yes, I mean, as you said, I mean, you're an integral part of everything.
Okay.
And so you're drawn towards certain things and you're repelled by
Okay.
certain things.
Fine. I want to hear if there are any people here who have been really moved by something and created change as a consequence.
I think that the universe is a mirror of our beliefs, and if we have a certain set belief system, if you say to yourself, I'm happy, I feel abundant, my life is wonderful, I feel like I'm on holiday every day, my work is a thrill to me, I'm passionate about it, I like working with people or whatever, I'm just happy doing what I'm doing, you'll go from success to success.
Right. But for some people, that's requiring a change because that's not the kind of mindset that they have been in, and they had to change their mindset in order to get there. David?
Change the country.
Change the country?
Yeah.
Did you do that?
We changed the country by moving from one country to another.
And that made a real change?
That's the change.
That is the change. So that's an external change that impacted you, and therefore you were a changed individual as a consequence. Okay?
So it's genetic and environmental changes, which is about 50 to 60%. And 40 is free will and how you perceive something. So you can only
How you choose to see things.
Perception towards things, and they don't necessarily have to change. It's how you see them and how you approach them.
Yeah, there's no objective reality as far as human beings are concerned. Everyone in this room sees everything differently. Everything's subjective. The way you perceive people around the table, the way you respond to the biscuits on the table, etc., is different than me and the next person.
But the biscuits are the same.
That's right. They appear to be the same, but the truth is they're not, because your eyes see them differently, your taste buds respond to them, even anticipation, differently. And if I would tell you they're from Glicks, then you would really jump at it straight away, etc. It's different. You would say, yeah, my logic, my mind says, hey, they're the same thing. But what's reality? The way you see it, the way I see it, or the way that a scientist might, under some microscope, define it? But I'm still waiting. Has no one ever read a book that has profoundly altered them?
Viktor Frankl's?
Viktor Frankl's book?
It's a change in consciousness, a change in perception. It's a shift. It's an energy.
Are you talking about a book that you read?
No.
That's
What happens when you change?
okay.
A book may provide it, an experience may provide it.
Yes.
Something in the street may provide it, where suddenly you move into the present, maybe you...
Absolutely. I just want to hear people's life experiences. Have there been issues, circumstances in your life that has created that for you?
I've just noticed only the last few weeks, somehow I was in a mindset that things just weren't working for me. And I kept seeing a sign, a hoarding in the street saying, unexpect the expected. And I'd never seen that before, but I kept seeing that sign, and I'm sure that sign was telling me something. And I also saw a sign, change your thinking. And I'm sure it wasn't by accident. And I've changed my thinking, I've stopped expecting, and things have changed for me.
Okay.
I'm not saying this to be...
No. Understood. Has Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead changed people here at the room? Has the State of Israel's establishment in 48 changed things in the room? Has the people that you met...
Nature, being out in nature, it's happened to me many times over the years.
Realisation.
Looking out into the sea and just feeling that you're part of something bigger.
Can you be open to change as opposed to being closed to change?
Absolutely. I think you can be closed, and sometimes it can be forced on you.
Yes? Despite yourself, you're saying? Okay. Fine.
I was just mentioning having children is a massive change for anyone, and sometimes you don't want that change forced upon you, but you adjust, you adapt, you're forced to grow.
What do you aspire to in life? What is it that you really would like to be able to secure in your life, and therefore you will exercise change and drive yourself through motivation to get it? Can you generalize?
Love and joy.
Love and joy.
Quiet enjoyment.
Quiet enjoyment.
Health.
Health and wellness.
Stillness, peace.
Stillness and peace. Abstract ideas, but ones that we all commonly can relate to.
Purpose.
Purpose.
Connectedness.
Connectedness. The primary motivation of people's lives. So Kabbalah says that the primary motivation relates to the word connectedness, and that all the things that you have said are ways and means of experiencing connectedness. What does joy mean? What does it mean to be happy?
It means to be sharing.
You're giving, when you say sharing, you're describing a circumstance where happiness will take place. But what is happiness?
A bliss feeling where you...
It's a feeling.
I think it's oneness.
Oneness.
I mean, where everything is united and moving together.
But it's different for different people.
Different for different people.
Happiness depends how you perceive it.
But there's a common denominator. Kabbalah says the common denominator is when things tend towards attraction and joining, connectedness, and pain is its opposite, when things remove and separate. Things that tend towards oneness as opposed to things that create duality, two-ness, separation, and the like. And this is the litmus test. This is the rule of thumb, that we all seek connectedness. That's why interpersonal relationships and the quality of those relationships is usually central. Our most profound experiences are ones that we have with each other. Our most profound pains are the ones we have with each other. Okay, equal and opposite. You mentioned Frankl. Frankl enunciates the same idea. The idea that the quest for purpose and meaning. What's purpose and meaning? Purpose and meaning means integration of perception of reality, putting it together. Disintegration causes frustration, confusion, words that aren't comfortable. Okay? So, and you can find that if you analyze it, most everything that provides you with a sense of enjoyment is integrative, and everything that causes you hurt and pain is disintegrative. Now see if you can find an exception to that. Because it's such a simple thing that Kabbalah teaches. It's a very simple litmus test.
Feeling connected to the universe, feeling at one...
That's already a big thing. But feeling connected to the biscuit because you enjoy the taste of it is also an aspect of it. The most mundane things as well as the big things.
What about the guilt connected to eating?
Guilt is the disintegrative. Guilt is very uncomfortable. Guilt means that in some shape or form I am at a distance. That's why guilt is uncomfortable. That's why absence from a loved one is uncomfortable. Not understanding the subject matter is uncomfortable. These are all situations of separation as opposed to situations of connectedness. And it's so simple. We'll get it complicated in a moment, though.
When the connectedness is too much and it's suffocating?
Okay, you're raising the complications that we need to look. We've looked at a very elegant, simple idea, and now we're going to find where it seems to fail. So I'm going to posit for you motivation theory that is going to take in that very circumstance that you have raised, and we're going to consider that also. In the literature, they speak about pleasure and pain as being the polar opposites. In Kabbalah, we talk about connectedness and disconnectedness. We don't speak in terms of pleasure and pain as the dichotomy. But pleasure and pain, nevertheless, are good examples of it. Pleasure means integrative, connectedness, oneness. Pain means separation. When you hurt your hand, when you stub your big toe on the chair and dance around making all sorts of strange noises, why do you do that? What's pain mean? Pain means that momentarily the cellular connectedness and interrelationship has been distorted from its normative state. And you feel it. It's painful. All pain of the body means dysfunction. Okay? When a person has completed that 5-mile run and feels the elation and the high from it, why? Because at that moment, their body is operating optimally. And they feel that optimal functionality by a sense of pleasure in the exercise. Okay? So pleasure and pain are good examples of connectedness and disconnectedness. But connectedness and disconnectedness are much wider constructs than simply pleasure and pain. Okay, having said that, I want to introduce you to the model. And you'll see it at the bottom of the page there. And that is the 5 elements that create the ultimate connectedness, which we use the English word pleasure for. Things are pleasureful because they are in a state of connectedness. Now, let's talk about pleasure for a moment. What things are pleasureful for you? Listening to music that you particularly like is pleasureful. Okay, observing a beautiful piece of artwork might be pleasureful. Enjoying the company of someone who is close to you might be pleasureful. All right. But then, using your example, might there be an excess of pleasure? Might there be a perverse pleasure? May there be a pleasure that hurts? Now we're going to complicate it a bit. So let's first introduce the basic duality. And that is that we are made up of 2 tendencies. Everyone in this room is made up of a tendency of preserving themselves, serving themselves, making sure that they survive, the survival instinct, the thing that Maslow calls food, clothing, and pleasure. Okay? Right? That's self. And then there's the other dimension of the individual, and that is service of otherness. That is serving God, serving your loved one, serving your child, whatever it might be, an act which is other-centered as opposed to self-centered. And these are the 2 basic directions that we always operate under. There aren't any others. We're either self-centered in the moment or we're other-centered in the moment. There's no grey area. Self-centeredness alone is not bad, to introduce a value term. You do have to eat. You do need to have clothing. You do need to have shelter. You can't survive without it. The problem is that that tendency can continue unabated. In other words, how much is enough? We call that tendency the product of the nefesh behamit. The nefesh behamit, as you've got it there in the right-hand side heading of the column, means ultimately the animalistic tendencies, which is metaphor of looking after yourself alone. As I said before, you can't survive unless you have that part of you. Unless you're able to look after yourself, you won't survive. However, the nefesh behamit doesn't know its limits. Food, does it have to be haute cuisine every night? Clothing, must you only wear designer label? Housing, does it mean you have to have a chandelier in the toilet as well? In other words, the nefesh behamit can continue on and on. I need more, I need more, I need more, I need more. Okay? The other part of self, the higher order self, says you need this much, you've satisfied those needs, now go to a higher plane. That's what the nefesh elokit does. The nefesh elokit is that part of self that controls the wild stallion of the nefesh behamit and allows it to act in service rather than to be the dominator. If the wild stallion is the dominator, eventually it'll destroy. When it's tamed, you utilize its energy. And this is what we call maturity. This is what we call self-control. This is what we call discipline, mastery. They're just euphemisms for the same notion of nefesh elokit, the process whereby we know we've got specific energies and forces, but we have to direct them in a way that is wise. Now let's apply it to the particular model. Pleasure is what we seek. That's what we seek. Ask yourself, all the things that you aspire to, isn't pleasure at the end of the day the bottom line? Or in this case, the top line.
But is it the pleasure itself, or is pleasure the result of what? Of you achieving?
It's going to be a result of many things, the four things underneath them. But, and we're going to get to those four things, but is that what we seek, pleasure? Is this the ultimate goal of humanity? Then what, and why would you say no?
Let her answer.
Sorry?
I didn't answer no. I'm in agreement, but I let her answer.
Why no? Just tell me something that you seek that's not pleasureful.
Sometimes I seek to do things that are more difficult than giving me pleasure, because the pleasure sometimes is too comfortable. So
But when you try to do things that are more difficult, why would you do that?
improvement, not pleasure. It's not pleasurable.
But doesn't improvement give you pleasure?
It's a challenge.
Doesn't a challenge give you pleasure?
Aspiration.
Doesn't aspiration give you pleasure?
It's trying to fill that, constantly trying to fill that void.
And I'm positing that pleasure is what fills the void.
And then there's still the void.
I tell you why you're uncomfortable with the word pleasure. Because in Western society and in English, we use it in a specific way. When we use the Hebrew, oneg, it doesn't have the same connotation. Oneg means not the pleasure of materialism, it means the higher order pleasure of experiencing oneness. It's the higher order pleasure of connectedness, the things we spoke just earlier. The experience of that oneness is called oneg. Yeah, the word oneg translates as pleasure. And then there's pleasures that are materialistic. When I say materialistic, I don't mean just money. Pleasures of the body, pleasures of the senses, pleasures that relate to me in my physical state. They're called lower order pleasures. They're the pleasures of the nefesh behamit. So there's a dichotomy of the way we use the word pleasure in the Hasidic teachings. Nefesh Elokit pleasure means higher order pleasure of creating oneness.
Couldn't you use the word love in transposing it for pleasure in oneg?
No, love is one aspect of what is one expression. There's many other expressions than love.
I think that spiritually today the word love seems to have a new connotation.
Yeah, but do you love the mathematics when you understand it?
That's why we're getting into semantics here.
No, really not. Because we're saying that there is a much bigger picture than love, a much bigger picture than material pleasure, and that's called connectedness.
I think that's what I'm trying to get at. I'm alluding to the fact that the word love spiritually in the world today that as is emerging seems to indicate that love is connectedness.
But what if we follow what the lady in the end there says, excessive love, unwise love, hurtful love?
No, because then we're discussing semantics again and how we construct the meaning of...
I love my child that I'll give my child everything. Everything.
Okay, but I'm not
and they're spoiled.
That, but I'm saying that today the word love can be used in another context.
I'm sure it can. From the Hasidic perspective, it's not big enough, the word love. Love is one expression of it. But when we talk about putting everything into a state of oneness, it's bigger than the word love.
Are you talking about euphoric?
Euphoric is already an experience of that oneness.
That's what I'm saying.
And love is an experience of the oneness. But there's more than love. As I said before, the quest to know something. Why is there a quest to know something? Why are we curiosity-ridden? Why must I know something, to use another particular pathway? Is because by putting it together and joining it, it's part of the satisfaction that I gain as a human being, because that's the way I've been designed. With people, it's love.
I don't think we have a language for what you're alluding to in actual fact.
Oh, we do in Hebrew, though.
In Hebrew, but not in English.
That's why I said the word pleasure doesn't give the connotation.
There is language within the English language, absolutely.
Okay.
There's incredibly euphoric feelings when you have an extraordinary connection to an activity.
I think Laibl saying that's a byproduct of this oneness.
It's an experience of it.
An experience of it. I look at it's academic because it's just a feeling of...
You'll see how it works if we go to the second level. If you look at the second level, which is ratzon. Ratzon means the flow of will, wantingness, desire, wishing. What's the difference between pleasure and will? The short answer, will is the pathway to pleasure. Pleasure is the goal. Will, the flow of will, is what drives you there. Will might be the vehicle, and pleasure is the destination. Okay? If you don't have the driver of willpower, you won't reach your destination of oneg. But if we then use again the dichotomy of nefesh elokit and nefesh bahamit, then what we get is two kinds of wills. In other words, the will for the higher order self and the will for the lower order self, which a classic example is addiction. I very much want the substance, I need the substance, I need to get the high, and I'll have an artificial high if I do take it, and it's highly pleasureful. But no one in this room would identify it with the way that we've been using the word pleasure or oneg in its higher order self. And that's because addiction is a driver towards an artificially induced high, whereas ratzon, in its pristine meaning, in the Hasidic terminology, means the drive to higher order pleasure. Yes?
I'm just looking at the English, the will. To me, when you look at addiction, it's almost the lack of will.
You're explaining it, though. When you want that stuff, you want it. You really want it. No two ways about it. You really do want it. It's not that you don't want it. Okay?
I think I'm struggling with the English.
Well, no, just use the word want. Use the word desire. Forget the word will.
But will has an action behind it. It is an intent.
Look, you're right that English is a bastard language. English is made up of Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, the Romance languages, Roman, Greek, and European. And therefore, English is a real mixed up language. That's why I can use so many different words for the word ratzon. I can come up with will, I can come up with desire, and I can come up with wantingness, etc. And they're all nuances of each other. And that's why conducting a session like this in English really is very difficult. If we spoke Hebrew, it would be so much easier, etc. So yeah, because you're talking about these nuances. So I said, I don't mind which one you use, desire, will, wanting, etc. But there's no question in my mind that when a person wants to get high and uses a substance to do it, they really want it.
But are you also including things like gambling addiction?
Yeah, definitely.
We'll make it simplistic. How many of us here have had that extra piece of help when we knew we didn't need it? Or that extra helping? It's, you know, don't put in such abstract terms.
That means that's the nefesh bahamit, which means what part of me wanted it? My bodily pleasure wants it. That's the difference that defines lower order self and higher order self. Okay? And everything on the right-hand column at nefesh bahamis will always be bodily based. Okay? Everything in terms of nefesh elokit is other based, outside of self. Self and outside of self. That's why sharing is so fulfilling.
Aren't some of those things actually also fear-based as well, not just physically based? I mean, physical part. I mean,
can be.
Sometimes fear can drive people to do things that are also negative.
Yes.
It's an emotional state, not.
Yeah, that's an overlay in terms of this, okay? When a person is afraid, that means they're in a state of separation, going back to our previous discussion, and therefore they will try to find all sorts of ways of overcoming fear by integrating, all right? Now, but very often, because they don't have a wise pathway, all they're doing is reinforcing the fear, and they're not finding their way to integrate it into one. All right? But coming back here, so ratzon is the driver that reaches the destination of oneg. Addiction, as an example, is the driver that reaches a state of euphoria artificially induced. Could be. I'm just using examples. Now, but those two alone won't get you anywhere unless you strategize. If you don't use your mind, there's no way that you can give direction to the will, to the desire. You want something. How are you going to get it? You want the ice cream? Well, you really have to get out of the house and go to the shop and buy it. Just because you want it, it's not going to appear magically like that. Okay? So seichel, mind, is that part of our self that strategizes for the will to be able to drive in the correct direction in order to experience the pleasure. Or, negatively, I must scheme how I'm going to get to that part of the marketplace where they sell the stuff that will be inducing me the high that I want to experience. Both similar kinds of mechanisms, both deal with the mind. But one area of the mind, or one expression of the mind, drives the person, provides the strategy for the person, I should say, for the driver to be able to achieve the higher order self, and the other one is using the same mind. So the nefesh elokit, nefesh bahamit, like in the Sefer Tanya, they're described as two warring armies battling for the one city, and that city is consciousness, your consciousness. And either the lower order self is the winner in the moment, or the higher order self is the winner in the moment. And they're constantly struggling. That's why we are basically in a constant state of struggle. Only tzaddikim no longer struggle. Everyone else struggles. But that struggle isn't necessarily like, oh wow, that's a draining struggle I'm talking about. I'm talking about decision making. I'm talking about awareness that there's a duality and our need to resolve it. At any one moment, every moment of the day, to live mindfully means to be able to recognize the duality of the moment and resolve it in a way which integrates as opposed to disintegrates. That's what mindful living is.
Rabbi, how does this relate to the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov?
The Yetzer Hara is the emotional expression of the Nefesh Bahamis. The Yetzer HaTov is the emotional expression of the Nefesh Elokis. Nefesh Elokis, Nefesh Bahamis are spiritual dimensions of self which manifest in certain ways. Yetzer means one of the manifestations, the emotional manifestation, as opposed to the mental manifestation.
The next one down, you mean?
Well, we're going to get there. Exactly, the next one down. So, just because you strategize doesn't mean that your body's going to move. The mind is cold. We describe that mind is cold and the heart is warm. What do we mean by that? You can be a cold, calculating, cerebral creature with an IQ of 180, absolutely brilliant, and not make any contribution to anyone's life. To make a contribution to someone's life, there has to be some fuel that you need to consume in order to make the car move. And that's called emotion. Without emotions, your body won't move. You have to feel in order to make your body move. You have to feel in order to open your mouth and speak. Speaking is an effort. Anything that requires effort requires some level of emotional input. Thought can also be an effort, but by and large, thought requires very little effort. Higher order thought requires more effort. Therefore, higher order thought requires emotional input to maintain it. All right? Focusing already requires energy. All right? It requires a feeling for it.
Why do you put focusing and emotions together?
I don't. I'm saying emotion is required in order to focus. I'm saying emotion is the fuel. Midos is the fuel for seichel. You won't focus unless you feel something in order to focus there. If you're not, you'll just daydream. You'll use the path of least resistance.
And in a way, for me, the actual emotions are the things that take you away from the higher aspirational aspects.
They shouldn't, because you should be able to, well, if they do, then your midos and your seichel are in a state of disassociation. To be a person who operates in an integrative way, all these things will have to line up. They'll have to be synergistic.
Like the tree.
Okay, when your emotions go one way and your mind goes another way, then you're going to not be a terribly effective individual.
We're going to extremes. I mean, emotions are so varied and so subtle. And thinking...
Only in English. In Chassidus, there are 7 very specific emotional tendencies clearly defined. In English, the word emotion means anything you want it to be, by and large, okay? And I can assure you that even the books of psychology, they're all mutually exclusive as to their definition as to what emotion is.
Will you do that for us? Will we get that information?
No.
Various levels of emotions, the names?
No, not now. Just no space for it. Are we going to do it at all? If you want me to, I'll try to fit something in like that, but probably not tonight.
What about psychopaths? I mean, they're really driven. I mean, I don't...
Absolutely, a very good example. They're very good examples of Nefesh Bahamis. Not because of fault, but because of chemistry, or because of circumstances that have created them in the current motivation vein that they have, etc.
What I'm talking about, though, is the proportion of them that's driven by the mind and the emotion.
Yeah, both. The mind and emotion can either be used for the higher order self or the lower order self. It can be used for the good or for the bad. It can be used to create oneness or to create separation. Torture, murder, needs to be strategized. Hitler was a wonderful strategist. He used mind to the greatest extent because he was highly motivated. He got a lot of pleasure out of eradicating Jews. So he had that sense of goal that was there. He had a strong willpower that drove him there. Absolutely. Without that willpower, he would not be involved in that process as successfully as he was. He needed to strategize, as we said. He had strong feelings about it. And as we're going to get to, his behaviors carried him to the direction that he wanted to achieve.
He was an opportunist as well.
But I mean,
all of those.
But the psychopath, though, I mean, isn't that the antithesis of? I mean, their goal would be the antithesis of what we're talking about in terms of connectedness, unless you count the connectedness of them being unified within their own self, but nobody else outside of them, because that's what they're aiming for.
That's where the word values comes into it. Whereas the world is very scared of using values, and the world has become highly relativistic and feels very safe and secure, saying that there's no such thing as good and bad, it's how you feel about it or how you see it or your individuality and things like that. In our tradition, there is an absolute good and there is an absolute bad. And murder happens to be one of the bad things. I think we all agree that murder's not a good thing.
Unless it was of Hitler.
But I don't know that anyone in the room can convince me logically that murder is wrong. In other words, I'm going to say to you that it's a belief system. It's going to come in a moment into our discussion. I don't think anyone in this room can convince me that murder is wrong as a matter of logic.
It's from a spiritual aspect, surely.
Spiritual, yeah. Logic, I'm saying.
Oh.
If I wanted to argue that murder's okay, I could argue it very cogently. I mean, what gives you the right to tell me that I shouldn't kill people if I get a thrill and enjoyment out of it? Why should you impose your will on mine?
Because you're telling someone else that it's okay to impose their will, but you're allowed to. Not, you're saying someone else can't impose
I'm saying,
their will.
Gesundheit, everyone should go around killing each other. Go for it.
They're all doing it anyhow, whether you give them permission or not.
That's cynical, but I'm just saying, around this table.
Because you're taking away someone else's choice, that's why it's logical.
Why am I taking away their choice?
Well, you're taking away their choice to stay alive by murdering them.
Let me make it complicated for you. What if they consent?
Well, then you're not murdering them.
And is that good? No. Is that okay?
That's a value thing.
That's what I'm talking about.
But I mean, if they consent in a way that's just assisted suicide.
No matter what word you say, would you say that that is a good thing or a bad thing?
There are things that work and don't work. And if one allows murder, then it's logically going to be fatalistic because we'll all kill each other.
Well, that's self-preservation. You're very egocentric. You just want to live. Okay, that's all you want. You don't care about me. You just want to live.
Oh, it's all to live. It just doesn't make any sense that we should all kill each other.
What if I get my thrill out of it? I get my kicks out of it? What gives you the right to deny me my pleasure in life? I don't believe there's an afterworld. I don't believe there's anything, reality to life. Life is an accident anyway, and I get my thrill out of killing. What makes you think that you can tell me that I can't do that?
Regulations, and surely.
Regulations are only what people make. I don't agree with what people make regulations.
But if you live for the self alone,
yeah,
then no one can convince you you are...
Absolutely. That's why logic is not going to create an answer. The answer is going to be on axiomatic beliefs. And you just believe that life is sacrosanct. You don't necessarily voice that too often because you may not be comfortable, but that's what you believe. You believe life is valuable. No way to prove it. No way to prove it.
Based on the value systems we've agreed into.
Not agreed.
People before Judaism were quite okay killing, as were Greeks and Romans or whatever, but we have taken on and agreed upon a value system.
Not we. Why say we? You have. I have. We each individually have. That's why we are in accord in this room that we're not comfortable with murder as such, because you actually believe that.
But we've made an agreement about that, because if we hadn't, we would be killing each other. And if we did go ahead unilaterally, the system...
I signed no agreement.
But unfortunately the system...
No, in Judaism, I'm talking really now. In Judaism, no one signed an agreement.
But you've bought into the values.
What's that mean to buy in? How did you buy in? What quid pro quo was there?
You'd be punished. And that's pain, and we choose not to have pain, as you said.
But that's a different motivation. I'm scared. I don't want to be punished. Okay.
But you will go out in the pain.
Oh, I'm just arguing about, I want to try to corner you to accept that you actually believe it. It's not because there's some agreement and you're contractually contracted to it. It's because you actually believe life to be valuable.
Based on thousands of years of conditioning.
Whatever, but you believe. You've adopted that belief.
Yes.
It's axiomatic, and that's what all of us have done. We don't necessarily admit to it, which is a problem. When I say we, I mean in the world, etc. We all follow belief systems, subtle belief systems, subtle beliefs, which we aren't even aware of. Like I use that example, which I often use. You drove a car to come here. You did. You know why you drove a car to come here? Because you believed that car is not a lethal weapon, that you will survive the carnage on the roads, and you will end up at this destination. There is no way that you could have predicted that. You simply believed it. We follow belief systems. Human beings are walking, talking belief systems.
How does it compare in the animal kingdom?
They don't. They're instinctively driven. That's another important discussion, what distinguishes a human from an animal, from a plant, from a stone. That's another discussion, etc. Okay, so let's go to the bottom line, Maisa, behaviors. Ma'aseh, behaviors, unless you actually move your hands and move your feet, all the fuel of emotions are not going to do much for you. And all the strategy will be for naught. And even though you have strong willpower, if you don't move your feet and move your hands, it makes nothing, and you will not experience pleasure. So everything reduces down to the bottom line. Human action, human behavior, where speech is also part of human behavior, etc. And that's why mitzvahs deal so often, the vast majority, with the doingness of life, not the thinkingness of life. We're not academics. We study a lot, we learn a lot, but unless it gets translated into the bottom line of everyday behavior, it's not worth a cracker. You may know all the Gemara in the world. You may be a completely fluent halachist. But if you go out there and don't speak nicely to the next person, what is all that academia worth? And same in all areas of life. Likewise, if you are a person who is a professor of ethical practices, whether it be in medicine or otherwise, but go out there and aren't an ethical person yourself, that means what? In other words, the Torah requires each one of us to filter down from oneg down to ma'aseh. And then there's a feedback loop. When you actually do move your feet masterfully, move your hands masterfully, the result is you will experience the oneg at the top. If the activities of the body are self-serving, then the result will be artificial experience of pleasure, the mundane pleasure, or the pleasure principle that psychology often speaks about, which is by and large mundane pleasures. Because that is a turn-on. But we're talking about a turn-on through the nefesh elokit, not a turn-on through the nefesh bahamit. Now, I've only introduced you to these steps this evening. Obviously, this is a whole area of study, and there are many, many books dealing with these specific principles. But I just want to go a little bit further and cover the next page in 2 minutes flat. But you've got the notes. In section 4 here, it's a much more subtle understanding then of the nature of oneg. And we learned there are two kinds of oneg. We call them tainuk hamurkov and tainuk haposhut. Tainuk hamurkov means that there is always three elements in the dynamic of pleasure. You have the thing that gives you pleasure, You've got the process of pleasure, and you've got the reflection of pleasure. Let me use a metaphor to explain. Say I want to show a PowerPoint slide. I will have three elements. I'll have the projector, I'll have the a screen, and I'll have the mechanism that projects onto the screen. There are three aspects of it. Okay? And there'll always be groups of threes in any one of these influences. To have pleasure, you need to have a source of pleasure. You've got to be the instrument of pleasure, and it's got to be reflected in your consciousness, otherwise it doesn't mean anything. In the Kabbalistic literature, it talks about the metaphor of the sun. The sun gives light, but everyone knows that if you go into outer space, it's dark. So what happened to the light of the sun when it's dark out there? Light doesn't have any impact unless there's something to reflect it. Earth is substance. It will reflect it. A leaf will reflect it. The result will be heat on earth, photosynthesis in the plant, etc. In other words, you've got to have always the three elements. And the way that we experience pleasure is likewise. And this section discusses it. I don't want to go into the degree of discussion here because we're not going to be able to cover in a mere few minutes what is complex. And if you want at any stage for us to develop what is in number 4, which is really profound, I just wanted to introduce you to show you the profundity of subtleties of human experience within at an emotional level that Hasidus and Kabbalah actually discusses. And the final aspect there is the way that different kinds of pleasures are expressed in terms of the vocals of pleasure. For example, we live at a point in history where music reflects the nature of society in a very different way than it did a couple of centuries ago. And music is a wonderful reflector of the nature of people at any one point in history. And you can talk in terms of music that's loud, percussive, beat, rhythm-oriented, and generating strong body movement by way of synergizing with it, and that's characteristic of modern times. And then you can live in a period in history where it's not like that. It's more melodic, it's more subtle, and your response to it is with a greater degree of inner stillness. And these are wonderful reflectors of the nature of society at any one time, without talking about good or bad, right or wrong at all, etc. Likewise, in our own lives, there are experiences that we find are highly animating, want us to get up and express, and then there are other experiences we have in life where we need to sit back, take it in, and just resonate with it within, in a state of quietude. So the wonderful sunset or sunrise, and you're sitting at the top of the hilltop and just observing the red ball of the sun setting into the blueness of the sea, and it's just absolutely remarkable, is very, very different than watching the antics of a chimpanzee at the zoo, which is also equally interesting in many respects, but has a different effect on you. So these are different aspects of oneg that the subtleties of Hasidus would describe also. And I just want to introduce that particular discussion so that you actually know that there is subject matter that is studied in that particular context. But time has run out on us. Are there any thoughts or ideas that you might have as a consequence of our discussion?